Hey everyone, and welcome to the FLATLINING Podcast from Fulcrum Strategies. I'm Matthew Handley, and with me is our President and CEO, Ron Howergan. Ron, how are you, sir?
I am good, thank you.
If you haven't checked it out yet, I encourage everyone to check out our conversation last week with 2 weeks ago, with the late Dr. Hurley's family. We had a very good time talking to them, sharing some of their memories of Dr. Hurley's life and keeping alive this notion that there is space to reform healthcare in this country that will clearly make it better for patients, but at the same time will also make it better for providers. So if you haven't listened to it, find it wherever you're listening to podcasts. It's last week's episode, or you can go to flatlining.net. Also be sure to share it across social media, send it to your friends, and let them know about this kind of unfortunate saga of events for this particular man and his family. And of course, we keep them in our prayers as well. Ron, let's talk a little bit about healthcare reform today. As you know, right now, we've got the Democratic National Convention going on in Chicago. And if there's a party that focuses more on healthcare in general, I would say it's the Democratic Party. As we've talked before, the Republicans have yet to put anything really substantial forward regarding health care. So let's talk big picture for a few moments. Health care is not at the top of the list for people this go around in the election. It comes secondary to the economy with inflation and the price of everyday goods. It comes further down than immigration. So what role, if any, do you think healthcare is going to play in this election going forward?
Other than maybe some, I don't want to call them niche issues, but very specific issues like, negotiating drug prices or abortion or things like that. I really don't think there's going to be much involved with it. I wouldn't be surprised if there is a presidential debate if there aren't any questions about healthcare. It just isn't hitting that level of interest from the voters of things that will either get you elected or keep you from being elected. Now, that's, to me, and again, I know this is my sort of industry, that's surprising to me when we see some of the upcoming cliffs that nobody seems to want to pay attention to, like, the projection that the Medicare Trust Fund will become insolvent in 2036. That's not that far away. Or in our own state, in North Carolina, we've got our treasurer saying that the state employees health plan may soon not be able to pay its bills at the rate it's losing money. So, there are those cliffs coming, but I don't think it's really going to have much play in the presidential election because it's not what's going to either get either party elected or keep them from being elected.
Well, and in the case of North Carolina with the treasurer, Dale Folwell, we know exactly why that state employees health plan may not be able to pay its bills, and it's in part because of the kind of asinine clear pricing project that he's been he's been working on since before COVID-19, believe it or not. Yeah. That's one of the reasons there. So that's obviously, I don't think a prescribed Medicare rate is going to be coming down the pike unless we get it through with the No Surprises Act, because we've seen Vice President Kamala Harris, as she seemed to have backed away from some of her primary positions that she had back in 2020, including being one of the many Democratic candidates that was supporting Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All plan. There's not any talk of that. I know Senator Sanders is supposed to talk later this week about what? I don't know, but I know he's speaking at the DNC. From this article in Stat, and we'll have it linked to the show notes, which is taking a look at some of the conversations happening at the DNC, there's not a whole lot talking. You're right. There's not a whole lot of conversation happen about healthcare other than those niche issues like Medicare, drug negotiations, rather. Of course, I want to talk. I do want to touch on that just for a minute because you had a moment on Monday night where they were talking about this Medicare drug pricing negotiation and how they were talking about how great it was that they're saving the federal government all this money. But we also know that there are some potential pitfalls when you start doing that. Can you just touch on those for a few minutes?
Well, as an economist, anytime you get into price controls, it makes me nervous. Because an awful lot of the time, the issues you create or the side effects can be worse than the problem. And let me begin by saying, we need to do something about drug prices. Okay, there's clearly an issue there, and there's a whole lot you could dig into. I mean, we could spend a whole series of 10 podcasts just getting into what's wrong with the way we handle, drug development, drug pricing, et cetera, in this country, and we wouldn't get to the bottom of it. So with that understanding, though, um, you start to get into price controls because it's a great sound bite. We've negotiated better pricing on drugs when it really wasn't a negotiation. You told somebody what you're going to pay.
Right.
And then you've got to look for what are those second order side effects. Is that going to keep certain drugs from being developed? Right now we have the development of drugs because there's massive profit at the other end of it. There's that pot of gold. Um, are you going to force the drug companies into doing something else? There's nothing that says these drug companies have to sell their product to Medicare.
Mm-hmm.
What happens the first time the government says to somebody that's created this wonderful new drug, hey, we want to pay less for it? And the company says, I don't think so. And are we going to have a scenario where seniors don't get that drug?
Right.
So again, the economist to me doesn't like price controls as a solution, but I will acknowledge there needs to be a solution. The problem is a complex, difficult solution does not play well in an election year when you
Nope.
want a 5 or 10 second soundbite.
Yeah, absolutely. There is absolutely no nuance, and we've talked about this before. There's no nuance when it comes to talking about healthcare as a matter of actual policy. Another example of that would be the caps on insulin at $35 a month. I know the Biden administration did get that into law for the Medicare patients, but I do think it's important to point out that all of the drug companies came out and said they were going to do that before it was enacted. In part because, as we've talked about before, companies like to get ahead of regulation. They don't like it when Washington steps in and tells them how to run their business. There's talk about, maybe changes to the Affordable Care Act. I'm assuming that would be expansions of the Affordable Care Act. I know Biden ran on a public option back in 2020. I don't think we're going to see many changes with how the Affordable Care Act is run unless you're seeing something that I'm not run.
I don't. I mean, it's another one of those things that is a great campaign discussion, especially when you're talking to, millions of people who get their insurance through the exchanges, which is a great thing for those people. Um, but to actually make changes to that is going to be extremely difficult, especially with a divided Congress. I mean, if one of the parties wins not only the White House, but also the Senate and the House, okay, then there's possibility of something happening. But if there's any sort of divided government, especially something as hyper focused and emotional as the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, you're not going to be able to make substantial changes to it. It's just not going to happen. And there are a lot of other issues that are, similar to that, where whoever the minority side is going to dig into whatever part of government they control.
I mentioned briefly, it seems like Vice President Harris has moved away from her views on Medicare for all. Whether or not that's practical or that she's actually kind of had an enlightenment moment on that, I don't know, and ultimately it doesn't matter. But it appears that progressives are looking the other way. And I just want to point this out, and you can comment if you want, Ron, that it appears that Democrats are finally realizing that voters don't, even Democratic and progressive voters don't really, it's not a big thing that garners support. It's like anything else with healthcare. It's not something that draws people to the polls.
Well, I think I think there's a couple things going on. Um, Anybody who knows anything about like competitive sailboat racing, okay, sailboat racing is all about putting your boat in a position where you cover the wind of the other sail. You take the wind away from it and you capture that wind. And that's why they keep tacking back and forth, is to get position. So if you think back to 4 years ago, okay, where there was a lot more discussion about Medicare for all, especially in the Democratic primaries, you had several candidates, Bernie Sanders sort of leading the way, that seemed to get a lot of traction with that. And so if you're somebody like Kamala Harris, you might want to lead into that to sort of steal some of their wind. Okay. Fast forward to now, there's nobody out there, and because it's not a Democratic primary, there's nobody out there that's taking wind from on a Medicare for all, because nobody's talking about it. So you don't need to do it. You combine that with the fact that it doesn't appear to be a winning issue right now. None of the polls show that if you come out hard for Medicare for all, you're suddenly going to pick up an extra 5% of the independent vote. It's a non-issue right now in the discussion or in the things that people want to talk about now. In some ways, I almost think about this as, and I can't remember who the one who coined it's the economy stupid, back in one of the Bush campaigns. With the kind of inflation that we've got going on right now, et cetera, like that, these other issues like Medicare for all are no longer in the limelight. And that's, and so for that reason, she backs away from it. It's not a winning issue. And she doesn't have to establish a position on it because there's nobody challenging her from that sort of far left.
The Republicans have to come up with a reasonable response to kind of garner votes for the people that do care about health care. The Democrats are making an issue out of Medicare drug pricing negotiations or price fixing, however you want to put it. The Republicans were very vague in their platform that they published after the RNC. They said they wanted to increase transparency, promote choice and competition, and expand access to affordable health care and prescription drug options. With regards to prescription drug options, that's probably the support for right to try. With increased transparency, hopefully it means enforcing laws that were enacted under the Trump administration that the Biden administration has decided to forego, such as hospital choice transparency laws and parts of the No Surprises Act, which I would hope if there is a second Trump administration, that those would be expanded upon and enforced.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually think, and I mean, this is sort of my opinion, I don't think when we talk about healthcare, I don't think the Republicans' issue is really as much the drug pricing negotiation. I think they've got a bigger issue with how they handle the abortion question. That's higher up on the sensitivity. It's a more emotional issue. We're seeing it in North Carolina right now in our governor's race. We've got the Democratic candidate who the people that are sort of backing him have got videos of the Republican candidate taking a very hard line with the statement, "It's not your body anymore." And now we've seen the Republican candidate come out with his own ad saying that he and his wife had an abortion and that he supports the current state law with protection. So that one to me is going to be a thornier issue for the Republicans. How do you appeal to your base who wants a fairly hard line? How do you support what the last Supreme Court decision was, which was, more in line with the Republican position without alienating too much of that middle independent that's going to decide the election, and specifically without alienating too many females? That's a really interesting tightrope for them. Now, I would argue that that's not really a healthcare issue. I mean, I understand that it is because it's a medical procedure, but to me, that's more of an emotional, personal rights, religious, it gets into a lot of other areas, unlike something like Medicare for all, which is a much more dominant healthcare issue. But even so, I think the abortion issue is going to be higher visibility for them and more of an impact than the Medicare drug pricing stuff.
Well, and I think you're right. Republicans lost roundly statewide here in Michigan in 2022 when we had a state constitutional amendment here on the ballot about putting abortion into the state constitution. And you'll notice that during the Republican National Convention last month, it was widely not talked about. And you've got you've got Donald Trump now saying he's not going to sign a national abortion ban, that it should be with the states. And the vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, supporting access to mifepristone, which we've talked about before, when that was in front of the Supreme Court, talking about what the FDA can and cannot do. So I think you're right. But I think you're right as well that it's more of a social issue rather than a healthcare issue. And I like to make that distinction when we've done different things on this program before, when we used to do our newsletter every week. Yeah. It's the healthcare stuff. You can tell it's healthcare because it's not very interesting to talk about. Exactly. When you're talking about policy and how we're going to pay for Medicare, that's not sexy talk. That's not interesting. Right. It doesn't, people are concerned about what their healthcare is going to cost, which is why I think Medicare for all gets as much support as it does sometimes. but it's how you actually do it is not quite as interesting. I wonder. So you said you don't think the drug pricing issue is going to be much of an issue for Republicans. You don't think they're going to run on repealing that then?
I don't. I think they'll have what they've got right now, which is a response that's pretty amorphous. The problem with the Medicare drug pricing thing is it's a very limited population that even is concerned about it. It's only the seniors,
Right.
And so it's hard to to really expand that into the other populations. So I don't think the Republicans are going to campaign hard on that. I think they're going to stick to what we've already seen for their ads, things like immigration, crime, inflation, all that stuff, because those are more in their wheelhouse. They feel more comfortable with it. To me, though, one of the interesting things is, as healthcare is sort of a non-issue in the campaigns, is somebody on January of next year is going to be occupying an office, and they're going to have a problem, and it's going to be a problem that wasn't well vetted or debated in the election. And do they choose to try to address the problem, or do they say, well, heck, my term is only 4 years, and Medicare's insolvency is 12 years down the road. I don't care about that.
Mm-hmm.
Even if I get elected to a second term, I'm out before Medicare goes dry. It's somebody else's problem. I'm sort of reminded by there's the clip from the movie Jaws when they're trying to close the beach, and the mayor is saying, I don't think you understand what this would mean to, this is the biggest weekend, it's where we get all our money. And the Richard Dreyfuss character says something to the effect of, I understand this problem. I don't think you understand that you're going to ignore it until it swims up and bites you in the ass. And unfortunately, I think that's my prediction for whatever administration comes next, is they're going to ignore this healthcare problem until they're faced with Medicare insolvency. I think the state of North Carolina is going to ignore it until they can't pay their bills. Because, as you put it, it's not sexy talk. It doesn't guarantee you reelection. It's not easy to encapsulate into a short speech. And the answers are hard. There isn't a magic solution. You can't wave your wand and make a declaration. There's some hard work that needs to be done there. And that's really not what we're into as a country right now.
Well, and I think about what Wendell Potter said when he was on our program a couple of months ago about, whenever you try and do something in healthcare and you move a dollar around, someone screams. It's because you're taking it from one section, putting it in another, and someone's losing it and someone's gaining it, which is why it's difficult to do. And we deal with that every day here at Fulcrum when we're trying to do stuff for our clients. Let's put it this perspective. And it's a great point to make. We do about $4 trillion a year of healthcare. Okay. Let's say that we are able to cut healthcare cost significantly. Okay. 10%. It's $400 billion. Mm-hmm. That's $400 billion of revenue to somebody. One man's expense is another man's revenue. There are whole industries that aren't that size. Okay. It's like shutting down a whole industry. Mm-hmm. And you're right. The people who are going to not get that revenue, whether they be a hospital, a doctor, a pharma company, a PBM, an insurance company, whoever, they're going to scream about it because they're going to want to hold on to that revenue. And that makes it extremely difficult. Well, one thing that I hope for is whoever is in the White House come January of next year, that when they put someone in the seat for Secretary of Health and Human Services, it's someone who has an idea of what they're doing, and not the Attorney General of California. I think that's been one of the biggest flaws of the Biden administration right now, is putting Javier Becerra in charge of Secretary of Health and Human Services. Not that I don't think that he's not intelligent. I just don't think he has any idea of how to run CMS or any of these other health entities that fall under HHS.
I second that. I completely agree. I mean, I'm not saying that I could run it, but it'd be a little bit like taking somebody with my background that is exclusively in healthcare and putting me in charge of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I don't know anything about nuclear power, and I damn well shouldn't be in charge of it. And I think Becerra, smart man who would have been a great attorney general. I don't know, but I don't think he's the right guy to handle the largest segment of our U.S. economy that's that complex. Mm-hmm.
Well, whoever it is, we'll certainly talk about it here on the Flatlining Podcast. If anything breaks at the DNC this week, we'll talk about it next week right here on the program. Although, Ron, I would be hard-pressed to believe that that's going to happen, at least in our field. But who knows? Anything can happen. I wasn't expecting Kamala Harris to be the nominee 6 weeks ago. So,
Exactly.
All right. Thank you, Ron. I appreciate it.
Thank you.